Hello and welcome to Arts First, the podcast that stands for freedom of expression in the arts and art for art's sake. I'm Niall Crowley, and with me is my co-host and the convener of the Arts and Society Forum, Wendy, Earle. We're joined by historian and writer James Heartfield. James is the author of numerous books including Death of the Subjects, Britain's Empires, A History, 1600 to 2020, and the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, 1838 to 1956, A History. He likes them titles. We're also joined by artist Rachel Jordan. Rachel is primarily a visual artist, but also one-third of The Nars, an experimental performance trio launched earlier this year with a show in Norwich titled Labour in Vain, and now stage a regular cabaret in London called World of the Absurd. You check out our notes accompanying this podcast for more details, please. Today we're discussing the exhibition Michael Craig Martin, 1967 to 2024, currently showing at the Royal Academy until the 10th of December. Craig Martin was born in Dublin in 1941, but grew up in the US studying fine art at Yale. He lived and worked in Britain since the mid-60s and has been a major figure on the contemporary art scene since the 1970s. James has very kindly made us a short video intro and his 5-minute tour around the exhibition with his thoughts and reflections on the work, which we will incorporate into the Substack. James, welcome to the podcast. Do you mind kicking us off with some of your initial thoughts, getting the conversation going?
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Niall. Great to see you and Rachel and Wendy. Nice to take part. And I don't think I would have seen this show if I hadn't been asked, but I was really glad I did. I really liked, there was something kind of pedantic and scientific about his entire approach. And you feel it's a bit like a Martian or a scientist trying to do art. The way it comes to it's so cold, it's beautiful. So there's a little booklet here that came with the exhibition. I was really glad I didn't read it before I had a look around because it's so clever. I don't think I could have had room for my own thoughts. But he kind of says, I think with the art, especially when you look at the earlier pieces where the style hasn't really become quite so involving and overtaking. You know, there's the early works like the one that I've put on the recording I did of The Box That Doesn't Close. It feels like a student trying to make something, but he's approaching it with such kind of oddly geometrical puzzle solving that you really feel it's amazingly managed and thought out. And then, you know, you only slowly get the emergence of this and the style that is best known for is these kind of line drawings of everyday objects, and that feels very pop art because of the selection of the objects, the cleanness of the line. It feels a bit like Patrick Caulfield, who I think is a bit more boring, to be honest. I thought this was much more interesting. I love the recognition, you know, when you see like the credit card or the sneaker, or, you know, jumble of objects like screws and shoes and all these things. And you feel that this is a great moment, like, which was the kind of manifesto of pop art. Just look at the everyday for us, not the everyday for the 19th century. So not less trees with the leaves in it, or more manufactured goods and consumer items and Coca-Cola cans. So I thought that was all really interesting, in a bit like Dougie Field, some of it, you know, in the look. And you think, well, what is there? And I think that he's doing a number of really interesting things. One is both abstract art, in the sense of you've quite quickly you realize you're not really looking at a sneaker. You're just looking at the shapes in the way that abstract artists would do. I love, in particular, there's a credit card. A credit card is such a fabulous thing because we all know it intimately. I think it takes very few lines to make a credit card appear in front of us. And, you know, it's kind of a mammal and also all that. But it also, when you look at it, it's a Rothko, you know, so it's got these strips of color. And you're thinking, I like the credit card Rothko of Craig Martin better than the slightly out of focus credit card that Rothko gives us. Yeah, so I thought it was really good fun and very inventive and very cold in a way that I like. There's a coolness in the execution, which can be very exciting in terms of what you see. And some of them are just like really funny, you know. So when he does all these old masters in his own kind of Dougie Fields type pop art style, you think this is great and I love it. And then for arbitrarily, there's a factory in the background in the distance. I think I said Monet when I meant Manet's Olympia, which is great. You know, it's almost like a cartoon by Art Spiegelman, the way he does it. I particularly like the sculptures for what they say to us about line. And I kind of said this on the clip that I filmed, but maybe we could come back to that or something.
I think there's quite a lot to come back to. That's a good way to kick us off, and quite a few things that I agreed with and didn't pick up on that you said. So that's a really good start. Rachel, do you want to tell us what you thought? And we can have a bit of a kick around.
I don't think I'm quite as enthusiastic as James. The coldness tends to turn me off after a while, although I do admire the way he can convey the sense of each of these objects with pure lines. They're so neat, and like James says, they're meticulous. There's the precision about them that's very appealing. And also in terms of the execution, from a purely material point of view, looking at the work, there's a lot of artists that try and do flat colour, but actually when you see the work close up, the paint is still patchy. Whereas with his work, it's absolutely solid colour. There's no variation in tone in each of the different colour areas. And that is why when you're there, the experience is quite an interesting one, because the colours are very strong and vibrant. And obviously the black lines as well are also very bold. I did quite like the tape drawings directly onto the wall, because again, that's just about pure drawing. I kind of like the way that he found this tape. I think it was in the 60s or the 70s, and he started using it because he didn't want any element of his own hand to come through. But equally, maybe that's something we can discuss later, because in a way that's why it's problematic. You can't get a sense of any sort of human element to the work he's creating. But actually, like James, I do think the sculptures are probably my favourite pieces, because they are really striking in the way that they look like 2D drawings and yet they are 3D objects. And I think it's interesting because of the sort of angle that he looks at the object is why they work so well visually. And also they're, again, like the paintings, they're extremely well made. And I have a lot of respect for artists that actually really care about how well executed their use of materials is.
Absolutely. Wendy?
I found myself quite excited about it, I suppose. I hadn't really planned to go, but then I was told what a fabulous exhibition it was. And I did find it initially very bewitching in a way, just exciting and all that colour. I did actually develop a kind of semi-migraine halfway through with all that bright colour. And I just found it really intriguing. I wanted to particularly mention his famous piece of conceptual art, which really hadn't come across before out of ignorance. And I find conceptual art quite problematic, because it seems to me like it's about the artist telling you what art is. You have no choice in the matter. That's kind of what he's doing. And then it seems to me he's also playing with it. So that little dialogue, which is a phony dialogue, because it's him asking the questions and giving the answers and explaining what he's doing. I think he's reflecting on Duchamp's urinal. He's making the point about who says what art is. It's the artist who says what art is. And that's a very provocative statement. I think he sees it as provocative. And a friend of mine said she hated the smirk on his face in one of the little videos on the Royal Academy website. But I think that smirk is sort of his own sense of it being a problematic statement and something maybe a teasing statement, perhaps, more than anything else. So I thought that was quite interesting, and I enjoyed that, thinking about it, because I think it's wrong. But then I think it's quite interesting because I was looking at another video where he was talking about the importance of audience and art as something that's social. And though he says he makes things because he wants to make them, he doesn't make them for the audience. If the audience consistently doesn't like them or doesn't engage with them, then in a way, what's the point? I thought that was also quite interesting in what he said. So then the final thing I looked at afterwards was a review, which was very negative about it, really gave it 2 stars and was very downplaying, and said it was empty and meaningless, and the art has no meaning. And I think you can see it like that. I mean, it's very flat, it's very technical, in a way, he's playing with ideas, creating a new language with his objects, which is quite an opaque language unless you really work hard at understanding. But it's very hard to know exactly what he's trying to say and whether he is trying to say anything at all, in fact. And then he also says in one of the interviews, or in that little pink book that James was pointing to, that he's, who is he kind of thing? Well, you can know him through his art. And then you think, oh, okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean he's empty? He has no meaning, or what? And so I think he teases us a lot. Actually, he teases the audience, the viewer, a lot in his work. And that, in a way, is what makes it engaging, because you keep coming back to say, is he just playing with the same thing again and again? And in the end, it becomes boring. Or is he trying to say something new with a very similar set of images configured differently, and the use of color as well? So I did find it a very intriguing exhibition, and visually, I think it's quite stunning.
Okay, that's really interesting. It would be really good to conclude with the question of meaning, if there is any, if there needs to be any. So if we could return to that, that would be really good. I think you said, Wendy, about conceptual art. It's not something I'm instantly drawn to and is usually difficult to understand. And I did admire the humour in this and in some of his other work as well.
I'm much more positive than everybody else, I think, or maybe not as positive as you. I didn't want to refer too much to the pink book because it's so good. But you do get a sense from it. He's amazingly thoughtful, and that itself, by the way, that's that's shocking, because so much art practice is this kind of anti-intellectual physicality, that we're all supposed to be excited about, like cavemen, daubing on with their fingers on the thing. Oh, look, colour. And a wavy line. And he's very good on the whole thing. He says, for example, on lines, I thought it was superb. He says, there are no lines. In nature, there are not lines. There are the shadings into each other. And he says, when you draw in lines, it's entirely an invention, an illusion that creates a kind of false drawing. So he's saying the drawing is false. He says, I didn't want to be a conceptual artist. I didn't think of myself as a conceptual artist. But he obviously is thinking a lot about what's happening when he's working, and what's happening with you when you're looking at it, and what this process is. So when you say meaningless, he's not sending a message, isn't he? Sam Goldwyn says if you wanted to send a message, that you should go to the telegram office. But in terms of meaning, it's full of meaning, because he's thinking all the time about, why is this here? I put this thing in front of you. And then, like a lot of abstract artists, thinking, what could I take away and it still be there? How much could I take away? And you can see exactly why he doesn't want the colours to be gradients or brushwork or anything like that, because you can feel that it would be a corruption of the process. It'd be outrageous if there was a bit of hatching or shading in one corner. One of the very early ones, which is, I think, a joke about minimalism. There was a guy, I forget, sort of did a black canvas of 1950 or so. I'm pretty sure that it was one of the group that called themselves hydropaths. We're afraid of water, it meant, because they were such boozers. And one guy did this, I think it was a white canvas, actually printed in a book, and he said it was frozen nuns in a snowstorm or something. And then he printed a whole book. One was just a red thing, and it was cardinals having a fight in a tomato field, and it was just a red colour. So he has these 3 black and 1 white drawing boards, and there's a bit of chalk dangling off a string, so like you could put something on here. But that seemed like it would have been better just the 1 black block of colour in Craig Martin style. Later, I guess it would have just been a single, and it would have been, if it was him, it would have been a very uniform black. You wouldn't be able to see any lines in it. But then I guess he'd already done that by then, and it moved on. So yeah, I don't think it has meaningless at all. But the meaning is the formal explorations that he's involved in. There's a certain amount of stuff, a bit like Claes Oldenburg, where he's messing with scale. As you're walking into the exhibition, you see a massive outline drawing of a screw, but of course it's about 6 foot high. And then he's next to a shoe, which is about 5 foot high. And the screw and shoe are, they're not to scale to each other. And there's a lot of things where he's playing with scale. But then also things where he's playing with, am I representing? I particularly like the credit card. I don't know why. I think because I just got my credit card renewed. And without it, I felt bereft. The credit card, it's like, well, how much can I take away from this picture and it still be the credit card? And it's not about credit cards. It's about drawing, isn't it? It's about what you're doing when you're drawing. Even though he is doing line drawing, but like Rachel says, you can't see his hand. You can't feel the movement of his hand in the drawing. It's a very graphic art style. And when he chooses the subjects like the Air Max, all at angles, which I think is particularly lovely, because we all crave for the Air Max. And, the rendition is superb. It is a bit like Patrick Caulfield in a way, but much more interesting.
Rachel, you were starting to raise some doubt and criticisms. Do you want to elaborate on where you're going, or has James convinced you? Or?
Yeah, I would say I'm not fully fixed in my view on him, because although I've seen individual works of his, or maybe 2 or 3 in a show, I've never seen. This is a huge retrospective spanning almost 60 years. And so it's been displayed extremely well. The Royal Academy has painted the walls to complement his paintings. And it is, in terms of colour, I understand why Wendy said about being a bit overwhelmed maybe, but it's a hard-hitting visual experience. I feel that in terms of meaning, I guess me personally, I'm looking for more. And I think part of me is still searching for what is he really trying to say? I get everything that James says about the formal qualities. And as I mentioned before, the brilliance of his line is indisputable. There was one work where I kind of breathed a sense of relief about meaning, because it was called Then and Now, and it's a set of 8 canvases, and they've got 2 objects on one canvas, and one is how it used to exist and what it's been superseded by. So, for example, there's an old TV set, the clunky looking one, overlaying with a flat screen TV. And he's done that with 8 pairs of objects. And for me, I was like, oh, finally, I feel like there's a comment. There's a comment about the passing of time, the evolution of technology. I was hopeful I'd go into the next room and there'd be more like that. But it was back to the decontextualized images floating in their own colour field or colour spaces. But I did spend a long time in the exhibition, and it did make me think, what is he trying to say? He does emphasise that he's keen on using objects that are familiar. He doesn't think that art should be mystifying. There is something to be said for that, because everyone can relate to these objects. And the day I went, it was a Tuesday and kind of lunchtime, and the exhibition was pretty packed. I thought that's maybe telling us something in terms of the fact that it appeals to a really wide range of people. But yeah, I'm still left feeling like there's still something a bit too cool and detached for me. But I do think as a body of work, it's incredibly consistent, and he's really just taken his idea to the max that he could probably.
It's interesting that he's, as James says in interviews, he's very articulate and smart, persuasive with his ideas. But at the same time, as you say, Rachel, he doesn't want any aspect of him or his personality, not even a brushstroke in his work. And that's quite an interesting contradiction. He seems to be full of contradictions. Wendy?
What I really like about him is that he's interested in art and the idea of art and moving art into the modern world. He's interested in art history and his own place in art history. But everything he says is about art. Like, his discussion of meaning is not about saying something. He's trying to reveal something about objects, colour or form, about how we look at the world and perceive things. But he's not dictating any kind of meaning. So he is leaving it open for us to think about that for ourselves, to try and think independently about it. And I think that's very refreshing in a context of a world where a lot of people who go to art galleries are looking for, what is this about? What is it saying? One of the continuing themes that I've come back to a couple of times on this podcast is the Hogarth exhibition. And people got really angry by the way the little information plaques on the Hogarth exhibition were telling people what to think, because people don't like to be told what to think. What's so refreshing about Michael Craig Martin is that he's absolutely not doing that. So he even says in one interview, or a couple of times, and sometimes he does repeat himself in interviews, interestingly. He says, when you ask somebody what they see in a picture, they'll say they see a shoe. But actually, it's not a shoe. It's a picture. it is just a picture. And it could be a picture of anything. It could be a picture of a safety pin and that sort of thing. And this critical review I read was complaining about how obvious some of his juxtapositions were, like of a slightly open closet. It was called pricks. Slightly open closet, the prick of a safety pin going into a bucket or something like that. She was saying, how banal is that? The thing is, that's how she read it. But you can't know that's how he necessarily intended her to read it. I think that's what makes him a much more interesting artist than I expected him to be. Sees art as a process of thought and thinking, trying to encourage thought and thinking, and not about dictating what people should think, which is, I think, the thing that really drives me nuts about social activist art, which is about telling you what to think. He talks about what makes an artist, and he says it's not talent. You can actually be fairly... But if you want to make art, you'll find a way. So it's to do with desire. You find a way to make art. I found that very interesting because it challenges everything I think about what an artist is. He says he's not good at drawing, and yet he's based his whole development of art on drawing. Curious man.
He clearly is a very interesting artist because we've been talking about him for the last 30 minutes and I feel like we've hardly scratched the surface. But we do have to sum up. James, do you want to give us any last thoughts?
I thought it would have been nice to talk about the colour because he really approached it a bit like, there's a principle in map drawing where any kind of map, the nations can't occupy the same space. When you draw a map, you only need 4 colours to differentiate all the nations because 4 points can meet in a map. And I thought his attitude to colour was a bit like that, is that the colours were really there to differentiate the spaces. I mean, in some ways you thought, oh yeah, I can see why I've chosen that. But then he's always pointing to you. It's like, well, why would I choose one color as opposed to another? So I think that must be a kind of a joke really about minimalist art. The one which is cobalt green, I think. Is there even a color called cobalt green with the white lines on it? And it's just so pedantic, the dashes, that you feel like he's really gone like, I'm really taking the mickey now to do the thing. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting somewhere in the writing. I think he's talking about minimalism or abstraction. He says, I was trying to do that thing, which is a bit like what people do in philosophy, to strip out any of the bringing of additional meaning in. It's only what's there is there. And there's no attempt to have some kind of symbolic meaning. All of that was pushed away. The mundane objects forbid you to make a narrative because the sheer banality of the objects means there's not a story there or anything like that. He's going out of his way. I think I can see what Rachel's saying is that the thing that she's looking for, he's trying to stop you getting. He doesn't want you to put meaning in that sense. He's saying it's only here that this thing that I'm doing, drawing. I can believe when he says he's not good at drawing, I bet he's tracing these things off, maybe photographs or what have you, with tracing paper, because where there's a will, there's a way, really says you shouldn't be, it's not about your eye. That's a kind of skill obsession, like it was this inner drive, this kind of magical quality that's inside you. He's saying, no, I'm going to think about what the thing that I'm doing, and I'm going to try and do it in the way that's appropriate.
Rachel, any last thoughts?
So as he acknowledges, what he started doing in an attempt to create a style that wasn't recognizable, in the sense he was trying to aim for some sort of very minimalist style of drawing that was sort of neutral, has evolved over time into something highly distinctive. Anyone who knows about art would say, oh, that's Michael Craig Martin. So I think there's something interesting in that you can never, artists cannot avoid themselves. Whatever work you create, something of you and your style will come through, even if you think you can't show that. But also in terms of his choice of objects, even though, yes, sometimes I was thinking, oh, another comb, another safety pin. And as I do have some sympathy with that reviewer, I think I read that same review, Wendy. I sort of think in a future century, what would people think when they looked at this? And it's a very interesting comment, even if that's not his ultimate intention. It's a comment on our material culture, in the sense that because of manufacturing and globalization, people all over the world would see these objects and know what they are. They'd know a safety pin, they'd know an iPhone, they'd know a flat screen TV, they'd know a corkscrew. And I think there's something quite interesting about that almost he is not fully aware of what he's done with his work, in the sense that he's presenting us a picture of material life in the 20th and 21st century.
That's great, thank you. James, Rachel, Wendy, thank you very much. That's a fascinating discussion. And the exhibition is still on at the Art Royal Academy until the 10th of December, I think. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.